Hi everyone. My name is Pierce, and I'm the director of the Transnational Literature Series here at Brookline Booksmith, and your host for tonight's conversation. I want to open up the space by saying thank you for coming out tonight. The Booksmith has been around since 1961, and that's because of our wonderful community. Your support means we can keep having events like this, so thank you again. As you may know, tonight's event is part of our ongoing Transnational Literature Series, which focuses on stories of migration, the intersection of politics and literature, and works in translation. If you enjoyed tonight's event, please check out our full events lineup online at brooklinebooksmith.com so you don't miss some of the amazing authors we have coming up this summer, both virtually and in store. You can also follow us on Instagram for updates. Toward the end of the event, we leave about 15 minutes or so for an audience Q&A followed by a signing. We have copies of tonight's featured books available over at the register. And please take a moment to silence your cell phones. I think that takes care of the business end of things, and I'd love to tell you a little bit about our guest. Tonight I have the very, very great honor of introducing poet, novelist, translator, essayist, critic, and scholar Ammiel Alcalay, here to present and honor the release of Controlled Demolition. The collection combines three of Ammiel's previously published poetic texts, Scrap Metal, the Cairo Notebooks, and From the Warring Factions, with a new work, Controlled Demolition. Unlike most writing categorized as documentary poetry, here the author and his process are constant reference points, serving as a prism to refract changes over time and circumstance in what becomes a mix of memoir, poetry, autocritique, prose, narrative history, and investigative journalism by other means. Ammiel's latest books are Controlled Demolition, his co-translation of Nasser Rabat's Gaza, the poems at its piece, and the forthcoming Follow the Person, Archival Encounters. In 2017, he received an American Book Award from the Before Columbus Foundation for his work as founder and general editor of Lost and Found, the CUNY Poetics Document Initiative. He is a distinguished professor at Queens College and the CUNY Graduate Center. His is the work, as the great Attila Nunn has said, where poetry, history, and fiction come together so that they can, further down, be broken into parts, again anew. And another great, Elias Hori, writes that Ammiel's voice combines revolt and depth, and his poetics takes the reader to a new approach of literary commitment. I'm so pleased to have him here tonight, and now Ammiel.
Thank you. Oh, on. There. How's that? Is that good? All right. Pierce told me to eat the microphone. I'm not going to go quite that far. But, so, thank you. It's really fun and strange to be here because I grew up about 10 blocks from here. So I'm going to start with a few translations, which is what I do these days because they're from Gaza, and that is where my mind and energies have been for quite some time. I got a message earlier today from my good friend Mossab Abu Toha, whose first book, Things You May Find Hidden in My Ear, I worked on with him and did an interview with him that's part of the book. And he recently got a Pulitzer Prize, which is kind of amazing. But anyways, he messaged me today. He said the situation is beyond what we can ever talk or write about. And that is part of, a poet's job. As Elias Hori says, no, actually, sorry, Sinan and Antoun, these illustrious people who provided commentary on this book. Sinan, who's a great novelist, he writes, the Arabs define poetry as saying the unsayable, which is what we try to do. So I'm going to start with a poem that I translated by a young poet who's living in Gaza, Sahar Rabah, who is actually Nasser's daughter. They have a competition going on in the household now about poetry. This is called The Bullet. The bullet goes right by you. In the wake of its echo, you count the wishes you're worn out waiting for. You absolve them and say, maybe there's more waiting to a lifetime. The bullet goes right by you. So you sketch string in a paper plane, a child's merciful fingers catch it, only to also be spared by chance from the blood of the massacre. The bullet goes right by you. You sleep an hour longer, you dream a rose grows in the depths of your veins, and light rain falls on the edges of the heart to make room for the poem. The bullet goes right by you. Shadow trees stretch out and doze off like your forgotten grief over there past the fence to the burial ground. The bullet goes right by you. A dove shakes the stars from its wings, casting peace upon your darkened way. The bullet goes right by you, and you smile for a lifetime of living, also delivered by accident and chance. She's an extraordinary poet. And this is by her dad, Nasser, whose book just came out, co-translated by myself and two friends, Khaled Al-Hili and Emna Skal. And this is a poem that Nasser sent me, well, what's today, 5 days ago. And I translated it myself. And I took a few risks in this translation. I did a few things that the title really would be How Many of Us Died? But I translated that as The Amount We Died. And I played around with it a little bit because there was a sense of a marketplace, like these corpses are being weighed. You know, Nasser is not an angry person, but this one kind of goes there. Nasser, The Amount We Died. This is going to come out in LitHub sometime soon. It wasn't so good for the flood to surge, for the water to carry the procession of the house on its bloody shoulders. It wasn't so good for long life to pose at the shore of endurance. So said my pain to the electrocardiograph. Coffee overflows, just like news bulletins lining up on monitors of the unseeable. No shadow dances with my palm, nothing left in the day's haggard pockets but dizzying hunger and rows of rubble. The flood surges and tanks chatter. The amount we died, no matter. The amount we died, no remembrance to count. It wasn't so good to invite Gaza to the kids' barbecue party. They slipped past childhood sorrow, leaving their hearts like birds on the windows of the house, and flying away they left the dishes empty as mirrors. Without waiting, they left us to cook the gravel, the firewood moaning, the flood roaring, and the jets and war, a hideous sky, malice fermenting in a suspect helmet. Background music for recurring Holocaust. How much we died, no matter. Burnt hands don't know to count. Nasser is a very powerful poet. I'll read one more from the book that I love. He's also very playful, very fantastical. This is called Gaza, Gaza. Most of these poems were written, we collected these poems from all his previous books, and there's only about 8 or 9 poems from the present war, but obviously it's filled with other wars. Gaza, Gaza. The gifts I didn't send you on war's birthday, the poems waved to me as I closed the book, like it was dying of gangrene. The bridges between my mouth and what I would say about anything shut down. The barracks next to the tall fence of my life. The time spent with old neighbors before they were scattered by the shell of absence. My dreams walking along with their old cane to a sea that couldn't care less. Last pill in the cabinet of hope. The beads in my rosary are endless and I'm delirious. Gaza, Gaza. Like flags of a country that defeated itself, from the heart to the heart they came back staring into the void, looking for old addresses in the salty mail. As for the songs embroidered on the dress of sand, the heart flows like a river of purified regret, whirling like a sunflower, like a name dead to the lover, inventing doves. Back to the heart they came back, stripped of their longing, nervous about how to open the suitcase of absence and let the snakes pour out. I am delirious. Gaza, Gaza. And I'll read just one more short one that, always gets to me because this is from March 18th, 2024. Hunger. Maybe a tomcat passes by late at night, maybe an acacia meows under the rubble, and it isn't from cold the houses shiver, while hunger howls, it howls in the north. A day passes and a day and a night, and the neighbor's son doesn't wake up. A day passes and a day and a night, and dust continues sleeping on the clotheslines. But where did the shell take my neighbors? And I'd be lying when I say, friends, it's all right. Every death is bearable, everything is bearable, every absence passes, except the hunger of my friends in the north. So, now we move on to no lighter subjects. This is a complicated book, and I'll say a few things about it and try to just give you a sense of it, because it's pretty crazy to try to give you a sense of a 550-page book in, half an hour. Consists of 4 books. 3 of them were written sequentially. So the Cairo Notebooks was finished in probably about 1990 or 91. And a lot of it is focused on years spent living in Jerusalem during the first Intifada. And where I worked quite a bit with victims of torture and all kinds of other things. The second book is called From Warring Factions, and it focuses on the massacre at Srebrenica in Bosnia. And other things that I do, I was really the only translator in the US for the first 2 years of the war in Bosnia. I was translating material from Bosnia. And that's a very strange book, because about 85% of it is composed of words that aren't mine. But you wouldn't really know that if you read it, because I use the words like the way a painter might use colors, just picking from a palette, of lists of words. The last one, which is a sequel to that From the Warring Factions, ends in August 2001, where one of the Serbian, I don't know if he was a general or what, was convicted of war crimes in The Hague. That was in August of 2001, and the controlled demolition focuses on 9/11. And there's a lot of different material in here. There's about, 12 or 15,000 pages of testimony, of interviews with firefighters and EMS workers that very intelligently, I think it was Tom Van Essen, who was the fire commissioner, asked people to do that quickly, like in October, to do an interview because they would start forgetting things. And anyway, so that's the whole framework of it. Begins. It's very complicated. I'm going to read you a few sections, and I hope you'll get the gist of it. But it begins with. I went to City College in New York City in the 70s, and I took intensive Latin, and then I studied Virgil. It's like the greatest reading experience of my life, reading the Aeneid in Latin. So it starts with that, but at that time there were a lot of Vietnam vets who were enrolled, who were taking classes. This is 1975, so the war is over. And interestingly enough, the vets did not really they went for Homer. They were not interested in Latin or Virgil, but we still hung out. And that's kind of one of the frames. The other frame is Virgil itself and that story. And then kind of, how did we get here? How did we get where we got to? So I'm going to read some sections of that. It's going to be very condensed, but you will get a sense. And before I read that, just to show you that unfortunately things replicate and continue in various ways. This is just a few short pieces from the Cairo Notebooks, which were written late 1980s. The nurses that we met from Sabra and Shatila, happy to be in Gaza. Some people at the vigil had relatives up there. The doctor was quoted as saying 6 people died and she amputated the legs of 7 others gunned down when they rushed to meet the food trucks trying to get in. After all the cats, dogs, mules, and other animals in the camp were eaten, the mother and her 5 children committed suicide to avoid having to turn to cannibalism. In Geneva, all the revolutionaries stayed in 5-star hotels. Tel Aviv, the Ayatollah floats over the central bus station. Textiles, cassettes, and tin. Posters of Saddam whirl and spin over the River Jordan. Mine eyes have seen the glory. So that's something to read tonight. Okay, this is from Controlled Demolition. My copy of Virgil, tattered boards, no spine, a stamp on the inner cover in fading magenta. And then the title page, The Greater Poems of Virgil, edited by J.B. Greeno and G.L. Kitteridge, Boston, USA, and London, published by Ginn and Company, 1902. My last note in the tattered volume, underlined at the end of Book 6, Gate of False Dreams. I walked down West Street and I noticed that there were body parts on the ground in front of me. As I'm walking, I noticed a foot. I noticed one corner of West Street on the corner before Liberty on the corner. It looked like intestines. Firefighter Frank Vasquez, ladder 15. Stone reliefs of great Assyrian palaces looted to the museums of Paris and London, give way to Iraqi state archives, whisked off to the Hoover Institute in Palo Alto. Tank treads over ziggurat brick at Ur. Any and all such glories, simply a prelude, steps along the march of progress from east to west, now ash in these last days of summer. The solemnity in the subway those first days, a sense of reverence as we went under all that death, now just expressionless, tired faces, unmoving lips, rustle of morning papers, dappled sunlight, gray sky over the bridge. All that rubble, the smoldering piles, not just water, but all the men who put it out. I was not surprised when I heard that Oreo had made it to the 78th floor. He made it up to the point of impact. Debbie Palmer. Oreo Palmer, chief of Battalion 7, based on West 19th Street and born just one day after me in 1956, took the elevator to the 41st floor of the South Tower before climbing the next 37 flights with over 50 pounds of gear in order to reach the sky lobby on the 78th floor, where he was joined by Fire Marshal Ronald Bucca, who had climbed up from the ground floor. They were the first firefighters to reach a zone that had been hit. It was 9:52 a.m. 7 minutes prior to the South Tower coming down, but there was little sign of raging fire or imminent collapse, despite Code 1's dead civilians at the site of impact. Palmer radioed his men, reporting that, "We've got 2 isolated pockets of fire. We should be able to knock it down with 2 lines. Radio that 78th floor. Numerous 1045, Code 1's, numerous civilians. We're gonna need 2 engines up here." When Marshal Bucca's body was recovered a month later, his coat was found covering the body of a woman he had tried to rescue. Chief Palmer's remains have still not been found or identified. Columns are trees. The loom is a mast to sail away, to sail away. When I think of so many friends that have gone on before me, I feel bereft as the world shreds the immensity of their journeys, the depth of thought, articulation, and feeling in each of their formulations, oxygen now, in the thickening miasma, suffocating the very being of our imagination to create the illusion of finished business. You don't build a democracy like you build a house, Mr. Wolfowitz said over tea, honey pastries, and water buffalo cheese. Democracy grows like a garden. If you can keep the weeds out and water the plants and you're patient, eventually you get something magnificent. In Joy Gordon's Invisible War, the United States and the Iraq sanctions, she writes, "In this chapter, I'm not interested in those measures that were particularly petty or ridiculous, or those that caused inconvenience or discomfort or marginally worsened poverty or caused illness or even caused tens or hundreds of deaths. What I want to explore now is the question of how a human catastrophe of this magnitude came about, what the policies and practices were that caused hundreds of thousands of deaths. These things do not come from blocking shipments of glue and laundry detergent, or even from building useless palaces." In a 60 Minutes interview aired on May 12, 1996, at the height of the sanctions regime, Leslie Stahl asked U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, We've heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died when in Hiroshima. You know, is the price worth it? Albright responded, I think this is a very hard choice, but the price, we think the price is worth it. The huge gaping holes right in the center of it, these places we once called home or life, as if nothing ever happened then or now, will somehow have to be accounted for. A short piece called End comes close to the beginning of Scrap Metal, in which the conviction for genocide of General Radislav Krstić on August 2nd, 2001 by the International Criminal Tribunal in The Hague is noted. And I have to ask myself a question one is not supposed to ask, as if even posing it implies being relegated to some lesser degree of humanity. Was that conviction for genocide a legal precedent to establish a different standard of justice, or simply propaganda to mask and divert attention from other, perhaps more sanctioned atrocities? Why Krstić and not Bush or Clinton or Albright? Why Eichmann and not Churchill? And in India, the rate went down to 18 per 100, but the local loan lice provided from imported bankers, so the total interest sweated out of the Indian farmers rose in Churchillian grandeur as when, and plus when, he returned to the putrid gold standard, as was about 1925, O my England. Thus Ezra Pound in Canto 74. Commenting on Ukrainian President Zelensky's speech to a joint meeting of Congress on December 21st, 2022, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said, "This was historic. Some people have compared it to Winston Churchill." Some of the CIA's covert Ukrainian ops from the 1940s to the 1990s included aerodynamic, QR dynamic, PD dynamic, and QR plum, to name just those we know of. By 91, the agency was already buying up property in Ukraine, getting safe houses ready, creating identities, grooming the people they would put in the right positions to make everything fit into the scheme of things. Even though their former chief's top diplomat had said, not 1 inch east. Never inside the country to raise the standard of living, but always abroad to increase the profits of usurers, Dixit Lenin. And gun sales lead to more gun sales. They do not clutter the market for gunnery. There is no saturation. Thus Pound again in Canto 74. Never inside the country. On whose behalf? In defense of what? Veterans sleeping on the street. Veterans done in by their own hand. So the Zodiac turns to a new age, but where is the water? No water on Highway 80. In his Yomiyat al-Harb war diary, the great Iraqi artist Dia Azawi, then living in exile in London, responded to the images on television and in the newspapers coming from the bombing of Iraq, begun by the US on January 17, 1991. In an unprecedented operation meant to bring the modern state of Iraq back to the pre-industrial age, the US air campaign targeted all key elements of the state's infrastructure. Azawi spent several weeks at home filling sketchbook after sketchbook in answer to the destruction he was seeing. Some of his most striking images respond to the bombing of the Al-Amiriya civilian shelter in Baghdad, where some 1,000 people were spending the night, seeking safe haven from the relentless attack on the city and the country. Early in the morning of February 13th, the shelter was hit by 2 laser-guided smart bombs, each weighing 1 ton, fired from US F-117s, killing 408 people of all ages, the youngest being 7 days old. The Pentagon's Director of Operations noted that both bombs landed right where they were programmed, while President Bush's spokesperson, Marlon Fitzwater, said, "We don't know why civilians were at that location, but we do know that Saddam Hussein does not share our value for the sanctity of human life." At the beginning of March, as Iraqi troops and others fleeing Kuwait assumed there was a ceasefire, US planes incinerated everything moving along Highway 80, the main thoroughfare leading to Basra. While images of this atrocity were hard to come by, Azawi reacted to a single photograph published in the London Observer of a man reaching up out of his tank, his eye sockets blank, his teeth gritted in rigor mortis, and his charred remains frozen in place. In Victim's portrait, color is restored to the man's dignity to his mouth. The burned out blackness has been relegated to the background, and you can feel the artist's hand as it moves in rage and love, from ochre to red, from white and yellow and black to green and blue. Two petty criminals took Pound at gunpoint, most likely for bounty, from the house at San Ambrogio near Rapallo on May 3rd, 1945. Not knowing what his fate might be, he slipped a copy of the Confucian classics and a small Chinese dictionary into his pocket as they left. He ended up at U.S. counterintelligence headquarters in Genoa, where he remained for about 3 weeks. Acting on orders cabled from Washington, he was transferred to the U.S. Army's Disciplinary Training Center just north of Pisa, where some 3,600 military prisoners, mostly African Americans, were interred. The only civilian inmate, he was put in one of the camp's death cells, a 6 by 6 foot steel cage open to the elements, which had been specially reinforced the night before his arrival with sections of heavy airstrip steel mesh, usually used to lay down temporary runways. Just as Pound was being taken to Pisa on May 22, 1945, Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's most senior intelligence officer on the Eastern Front, surrendered to an American counterintelligence corps team. By August, Gehlen was in Washington, launching a new phase of his career that would have significant impact on the course of the Cold War. Much of what he brought to the table was derived from his role in the torture, interrogation, and murder of starvation by some 4 million Soviet prisoners of war. Like many others, Gustav Hilger also surrendered to U.S. forces in May 1945 before he was quietly shipped to Washington for debriefing at Fort Hunt, otherwise known as Box 1142. In addition to various roles on the Eastern Front, in one case providing cover for those involved in mass killings in Serbia, friends, family, Hilger played a significant part in SS efforts to capture and exterminate Italian Jews. I remember a glorious and joyful outdoor feast when the elders were still alive and their memories still real. The year my brother and I visited the village that had harbored our father and his immediate family for close to a year as German soldiers swept through the Italian countryside. I'd come across the Adriatic, leaving Diocletian behind as aerial threats seemed live between Aviano and the warring factions. Or was it simply subterfuge, just another lie like the one night in Sarajevo, so unlike the first trip I'd made, as if propelled from all those places and persons in which and whom I'd found true refuge to adopt some imputed code attributed to some supposedly truer self whose pull was just ancestral. I didn't exactly know where I was going, but I walked up the steps, the Spanish steps that Ed Dorn had come to when he knew he was dying. I wanted to see the Pantheon. But it was for Keats, too, to pay homage to the poet in his glory and his suffering. And how many times have I read those lines, for the gondolas cost too much that year? But I was in Rome and kept climbing the hill until I found a hotel, and the man behind the desk asked me where I was from, and he began telling me about his life in America, as a boxer, as a middleweight, until he came back home to Rome. In the morning, I walked back down the steps, heading for the Pantheon, stopping for an espresso in the morning paper, knowing I had only a few more hours, but feeling like I'd never lived anywhere else before. Before the towers, dates do matter, things intertwine. The Mujahideen, the end of the Soviet Union, the wars of succession, so much unfinished business. Madrid turned into Oslo, and the Tunisians in their limousines and tailored Italian suits would stage a return to command those who never left or had already come back. Like Ali, 17 years later, after the huge prisoner exchange before the first Intifada, we often walked from the office to Salah ad-Din or Damascus Gate, talking and talking and talking about all manner of things. Or Jamila, who might meet at Jaffa Gate, and from there we'd stop at her family's pharmacy just before closing to check in and say hello. In the bus once, on the way to her house in Beit Hanina, she told me everything she remembered from the war when her father was killed. We'd sit on her porch, her mother inside, talking and drinking lemon. So many familiar faces suddenly thrust into the public eye, the war of stones and slingshots and broken limbs eviscerated in the pit of discourse. The shackles that had burst asunder snapped shut. Hagar drowned in a wadi, Faisal dead in Kuwait. If the aim is to regain our senses, is there a way to write again past the point of saturation, of overproduction, to plumb the depth of linguistic memory, by this obsessive scratching at the surface of events, by this relentless turning of the prism? Cast headlong into the waters, The first is left nameless. Had I 100 tongues, 100 mouths, a voice as strong as iron. I'm going to be haunted by the dust for the rest of my life, so Jeanette McKinley of 110 Liberty Street across Building 4, brief as that rest would be, diagnosed with brain cancer, then paralyzed by a stroke. She died in 2010. Loud explosions could be heard before the collapse on televised news reports. Throughout the day and for at least the following few days, the narrative had not yet been set in stone, and journalists actually reported what they were hearing and seeing. In an analysis of 70 hours of coverage from 11 different news channels, the explanation most given for the collapse was that it came about through explosion or demolition. Captain Philip Ravullo sitting with a group of firefighters. You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails like you're in a foundry, like lava. Yeah, chimed in the others, like lava from a volcano. Fear, harsh grief, and many shapes of slaughter. Imperative to name evil, mandate the quick corrective. Far too many report what they actually see and hear, if even only for a day or two, before state business became none of our business, as if it was inevitable, the fault of everyone and no one, paid to destroy and paid to rebuild. They're going after our brains, says Lieutenant Colonel Jabbar Abu Natiha, head of Baghdad's police organized crime unit. It is a big operation, maybe even a movement. And I would add our eyes and ears and hearts as passports turn up intact in the dust and rubble, and almost half the list of hijackers turn up alive. And now again, at what temperature does steel lose its strength? Like an anvil sitting on our tongue, like an owl on a dollar bill, like an owl in the light, like the eye of a pyramid, the carcass of a fish, the mockery of water, the cedar coffin of Osiris. George Stephanopoulos, ABC News. How do we know when this war is won? Vice President Cheney says it might not end in our lifetime. General Myers. I think that may be correct. This is going to be a long, hard-fought conflict, and it will be global in scale, and it won't be, as I mentioned earlier, it won't be just military. It's going to be all the instruments of our national power with our friends and allies, and the fact that it could last several years or many years or maybe our lifetimes would not surprise me. Of the many dead, some they buried in the earth, some they hauled to nearby fields. And I'm going to end with the coda. I know the mariner of mariners, the one whose story I will tell you, proclaims Mudaffar al-Nawab, poet from Iraq, speaking with and for those with something to say. I know the driver of drivers, and it is me, having by now driven hundreds of thousands of miles on the surface of the roads of my country, day and night, in every season and every kind of weather, in cars and trucks, through forlorn and forgotten towns and cities that have surely seen much better days than those or these. I hadn't been to the 9/11 memorial and only found out as I was writing this that a line from Virgil's Aeneid, in letters shaped of steel remains from the collapse, greets visitors to the site. No day shall erase you from the memory of time. A perfect line and thought, but it occurs in Book 9, commemorating the lover warriors Nisus and Euryalus, who in pitched battle, almost greedy with rage and bloodlust, go on a killing spree before Euryalus himself, thoughtless boy, is killed with Nisus to follow. Then, pierced, he cast himself upon his lifeless friend. There, at last, he found his rest in death. Soon the heads of both warriors are fastened on uplifted spikes. And if it had been another line, such as, I could not find you, friend, or bury you before I left, or I weep for righteousness, for ancient trust. In my copy of Virgil, Tattered Boards, No Spine, that I began this with, and which I've had now almost 50 years, Greenough and Kitteridge write, yet the traditions are no longer living. The machinery is no longer a matter of belief. The traditions are dug out by antiquarian research. The machinery is manufactured to order, as it were, in a modern workshop. Has that been my way here? The soul protects, commiserates with, and shelters the body. Like when memory protected from oblivion the poems Faraj couldn't write in one prison until he was transferred to another, and found tea that could stand in for ink to unburden memory and begin to forget. And all these voices keep asking me to take them, as if you could break the bonds of fate and scatter purple flowers. Thank you.
Is there anything you wanted to say?
Anything I wanted to say?
No, then we'll
Read the book.
We'll turn. Is this on? Hello? Is this on? Hello? There we go. Okay. Hi, everyone. We're going to go to audience Q&A now. Anyone have a burning question to start? Okay, I'm going to start then.
Okay.
So at the end, you mentioned very quickly Faraj. And so
Yes.
I wonder if you could tell folks who don't know about that book, and that was our very first Transnational series event with Ammiel, so it's very
Wow.
special to me.
Very special. This is a book called A Dove in Free Flight, okay? And the story of this book is Elias Khoury, dear friend who passed not that long ago, was teaching at NYU part of the year for a number of years. And he taught a class on Arab prison literature, and I sat in on it. And he gave us this book by a Syrian poet, Faraj Bayraktar, who had been in prison for 13 plus years, and it completely blew us away. And one of the students, another sadly departed friend, Sharia Taligani, who actually became a colleague at Queens College, a brilliant scholar who wrote a great book on Syrian prison literature and the kind of regime of human rights, translated one of the poems, and then I suggested to the group, I said, why don't we do this as a collective project? Let's translate the whole manuscript. So we did, and we began publishing poems in very different kinds of venues, because this is an unheard of writer. People don't even know where Syria is, etc. You know, it is America, and so it was lined up to be published with a friend, and then I was attacked by neocons at some point. And what they did, besides following my work very closely, which actually was quite intelligent of them, they listed all the funders of people that I worked with. So this person got defunded and they couldn't publish the book. And I spent 16 years trying to find a publisher for this book, which is insane and indicative of all kinds of problems. But happily, you know, we had, thanks to Pierce, we, at least by Zoom, we were gathered. Faraj was in Sweden, Elias at the time was in France, not in Beirut, and me and Sharia were in New York. Now, the beautiful part of this is I met Faraj a couple of months ago, and this is an extraordinary story, and Eman was there, my friend. There's a wonderful scholar in North Carolina whose name is Elaf Badreddin, and he wrote a book about music by Syrian prisoners. And he gathered a group of people who had been together in Saydnaya prison, the most notorious prison in Syria, and they actually got visas and they came to the US and they did 3 performances, one of them in Philadelphia. We tried to get them a thing in New York, but the dates didn't work, but they'll come back. And it was absolutely extraordinary. I mean, it was magical just to meet Faraj, but then to see them play and sing. And people came from halfway across the country who had been in prison with them to see them. I'm now writing an introduction for a new book of Faraj's that will come out with Yale, translated by Yona Al-Busti, and it's beautiful. It's his later poems. And so, yeah, that's the story. And this book is still available. It's published by my dear friends at Upset Press in Brooklyn. So this book, you know, we wanted to make this book into a kind of a kit, and there's the translator's introduction, there's a text by Elias, and there's a long interview with Faraj by Muhammad Ali al-Atassi, and it is one of the most astonishing texts. I've dealt a lot with torture accounts, with texts by people who've been political prisoners and so forth. I never heard anybody ask the questions that Muhammad asked Faraj. He asked him how he felt about his body. He asked him how he felt about it. It was just something absolutely extraordinary. And that last text there, you know, it's not that easily understandable if you don't know the context, but okay. The soul protects, commiserates with, and shelters the body. Like when memory protected from oblivion the poems Faraj couldn't write in one prison until he was transferred to another, and found tea that could stand in for ink to unburden memory and begin to forget. While he was in the worst prisons, he couldn't write his poems. They had to memorize them. And so some of the poems exited the prison with other prisoners who also memorized them. And when he went to a prison where he could write on cigarette papers with tea and a twig, he could unburden his memory because he was able to write them. So, and that's very much also a bit of a play on Mahmoud Darwish's masterpiece, Memory for Forgetfulness, because you have to have, you know, you have to have memory in order to forget something. So,
Wonderful, thank you
Yeah.
so much. Any questions? Yes.
First, thank you very much for that effort. Well, I happen to be a native Arabic speaker, and I've tried translation. I'm a mathematician, so it's a very different kind of translation.
yeah,
But I know you know someone who has been involved in translating poetry, Miran Hossein.
of course.
Yeah. And one year I was talking to her and trying to compare. I'd like to find out how you've done your translation from Arabic, because let me tell you the story there. So she was involved with someone else who is not a native Arabic speaker, someone by the name of Sam Hazel.
Yeah, sure.
And at the end, there was a collection of poetry that I think was Adonis.
Lebanese, yeah.
And then I saw the book, the collection, and I was comparing the Arabic with the English. And then I was talking to, he was there, Mr. Hazel, and he didn't speak Arabic, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
But on the book, he was identified as the translator, and Miran was not. He thanked her,
Mm-hmm.
but it was, and then when I asked him, how could you, why don't you give equal credit?
Yeah, that's the native informant model.
Yeah, and
which is-
then he said, she's not a poet. She doesn't know how to write poetry in English.
yeah.
And okay, I didn't want to be impolite, and I just stopped. But I mean, you've been involved in doing wonderful work. I mean, this is the people you mentioned are very well known. All of them, they're wonderful people. How do you do the work of translation?
Depends, you know. I mean, it's a great question. I mean, you know, that model has been used for a long time. You know Salma Jayusi, of course, and Salma in Prota, when they did the big project of Arabic translation, they would often have, you know, either Mai or Lena working with the Arabic, and then some American or British person who didn't necessarily know Arabic, but would work on a so-called English. I find that very problematic because
How do you check the original? I mean, still.
I mean,
what do you work from?
from the original.
So you don't need someone in between.
No,
You can go direct.
yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
so you're in a different situation.
Yeah. But sometimes I work collaboratively because it's fun and it's interesting. And the reason why I do that, especially in this project, was really interesting. And it was the first time I'd done that because I translate from a number of languages. There's something very interesting that happens when you work collaboratively is the language ends up belonging to no one. And so it kind of has it's very hard to detect. You'd have to have some really acute linguistic analysis to detect it, but it ends up, oddities creep in that are very poetic and are very subtle because you've got 3 or 4 or 5 people's language in there somewhere. And it's always a discussion, like, okay, how are we going to resolve this problem? Some person thinks it should be this way, some person thinks it should be that way. We look, we think, what are the references? What does it seem? What direction does it seem to be going? Is it ironic? Is it, you try to determine what it is. And like in the poem that I read by Nasser, I took some liberties because there was something I felt in what he was saying that normally the first lot of the title would be how many of us died. Kam Madna. But there was something, as I read the poem, I felt like he was measuring it. It was almost like, how much of those peanuts, it was like, it was transactional almost. It was very brutal, And so I wanted that idea that the amount we died, just to make it a little bit odd in English. Now, you don't want to exoticize either, so.
I'll say one more thing before passing it on. One thing I've done, just this. I've been testing this system called ChatGPT, and I've put poems in Arabic into it.
Uh-huh.
It came out garbage. And then I went somewhere else with something that is not poetry, and did things in my profession, and I could detect what was the content,
Right.
but the amount spent in trying to rectify.
Yeah, no, it's not worth it,
was,
yeah. You got another, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very intrigued by what was the original text for How Much Death. It makes me think about, is there any back translation that happens to make sure that the original author sort of agrees with the translation?
It depends. In this case, I was actually messaging back and forth to Nasser, who was in Gaza, and he said, go for it, He was fine, and his English is good. So, yeah. But, I look, in this new book of Faraj's, there's only about 3 poems that are from this book. And they're different, and it's great, I have no, we did something different. I mean, the translation ultimately is it's a reading of something, and I do like to be accurate, but I also like to find a way to transmit what feels like the poetic intent of the poem without, how did it get to be a poem, So many translations are just feel lifeless sometimes because people are unwilling to just take a little turn of something that might not be perfectly correct grammatically, or which is not to say that it's not accurate, but it still needs to be a poem. Yeah.
What was your inspiration for your book?
For this controlled demolition? Life, I don't know, okay, so it's a great question. I'm not being facetious at all, but so I wrote, chronologically speaking, the Cairo Notebooks was written mainly in the 1980s, okay? And when that was done, more or less, the breakup of Yugoslavia was happening, and I was very involved in that in many ways. And so I began this other book, From the Warring Factions. And then, I mean, being in New York at the time and thinking about the geopolitical, historical, everything, 9/11 is a big event. And, I began, what I do is, like Dostoevsky did this, he just was an inveterate clipper of, news items. I have piles of, now with the internet, you just send a link to yourself and hopefully it doesn't disappear. But I usually print things out and I have enormous files of stuff. I just collect stuff. And I was collecting, I watched it, I could see it out my window. I watched this thing happen and it was kind of implausible. It didn't make sense. So over the last, 20 years, I read a lot, I thought a lot, opinions changed, the architects and engineers began to speak up. The firefighters and EMS workers' testimonies are extraordinary, if you really start looking at them. The toxicities are also, many people have continued to die, especially EMS workers and firefighters. And this is the, I was listening to an extraordinary, I can't remember her name, an Iranian doctor who works with war toxicities, and she's been studying Gaza and Syria and Lebanon and 9/11, Ground Zero, and finding very similar combinations of toxicities that cause cancers and birth defects, and Iraq also she studied. So, I feel like that book, the underbelly of it is a lot about Iraq, but also I'm very interested in ancient Near Eastern cultures, and I feel as if what the US has been doing is obliterating those cultures to turn us into whatever, these consuming, gluttonous, digitalized, idiots. And, so I think for me, and I've studied a lot of these cultures, I've studied them a lot, and I wanted to find a way, also, I think, which I didn't consciously set out to do, but as I was doing it, I realized it was happening. I wanted to put these workers, these firefighters and these EMS people into the world, because it's been this American story, and it isn't. It isn't at all. And, those are the same people, under very different conditions. Okay, the cover, a friend of mine, Chris Russell, who is a genius, an extraordinary artist. If you look carefully, one side is Gaza, one side is Ground Zero. See if you can figure it out from what's in here. Okay, so I was interested in people who, like in Gaza, the civil rescue people. They are going to dig with their hands. They're going to dive into any situation, and that's what the firemen did. They went into. They didn't know what they were going into, and a lot of them didn't come out. So that to me is a kind of ultimate work situation, okay, where you're willing, you have a job, and this is what you do, and you're willing to die to fulfill your duty. I think it's very important to. So it's also to kind of pay homage to that, but also to put it in a geopolitical context about how this show was run and who was running it and what kinds of insanity, we're asked to believe, when evidence is like directly staring you in the face. So that's a little bit of what pushed me to, and I write a lot of journalism, and I consider a book like this, it's kind of like history and journalism by other means. And even though it appears complicated, I think, if I read this straight through, I could probably do it in less than 2 hours. I think you would be gripped, hearing the whole thing. I think you would pay attention because there are rhythms, there's a pace, there's things that are very sharp and come at you, there's things that are more abstract, but I'm not going to write a novel about it, but this seems to me a way to approach this in a mix of prose and poetry and documentation. It was the way I did it, yeah.
And at what point did you decide to bind them together to make this one? What was the thing behind
When a
that?
publisher finally agreed to do it, I've been wanting to do this for a long time. I always felt that there was a continuity to these texts, that when one finished, it spurned another one. And then Scrap Metal, which was written after From the Warring Factions, is kind of a commentary on everything. And one of the editors, a former student of mine, had the brilliant idea of disrupting the chronology, putting that first as a kind of preface in a way. And the other thing that you had mentioned, there's a lot of self-commentary in here, and partially that's because nobody writes about my work. So, the only way that I can figure out what the hell is going on is if I look at it and try to understand it myself. So often I'm writing as a response to my own work, because nobody, like a lot of people respond. I get letters, I get emails, people, really amazing. I feel like I know probably half my readers, which is great, but there's like no outer critical whatever, so I have to think about that, because otherwise you get stuck, and you're not moving ahead. So there's a lot of self-reference in here, not in any narcissistic way, but just like, in Scrap Metal I said this, but well, now we're 18 years later or whatever, I'm going to think about this a little differently. Yeah.
I think that's very natural.
I want to ask you something a little bit general, but therefore a little vague, I guess, which is about like the role that you see that poetry is occupying in this war in Gaza. I would say, in your experience of poetry and war, are there differences, similarities? Are there things that you, that you're noticing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, so I did a reading in New York at the St. Mark's Poetry Project with Mossad in February. There were 450 people there. It was packed. And when I started, I said, I think that all these people came because they think we have something to say, And so I think the question is, does one have something to say, really, And when you have, for instance, a lot of the translations that I've done are, I'm not thinking like, it's not, paternalistic, like, I want to help this person, whatever. I want to challenge the people that are reading English, And so, like during the war in Bosnia, I translated a book called Sarajevo Blues by Samezdin Mehmedinovic. And it was like a direct challenge to American writers, saying, hey, okay, it's 1992, 1993, what are you thinking about? Like, what are you thinking about now? And so it wasn't, so what I would say is, everything in this culture gets commodified. Everything is, and poetry, the stakes are quite low because there's nothing to gain, really. There's no money, there's a wee bits of fame here and there for 10 seconds. But, there are periods in which I've spent, there's a lot of references in here to Vietnam vets. And during the war in Vietnam, there were a group of vets, not the ones whose names you'll know probably, but who started publishing their own poetry. One of the first presses was called First Casualty Press in Brooklyn. They published the anthology called Winning Hearts and Minds. Okay, and that poetry is still extremely powerful. And people who wrote it said, I grew up like this is the last thing I'd ever think of doing, you know, but it saved my life, you know, to be able to express in this way. So I think, you know, actually with all the poetry that people are seeing from Gaza, about Gaza, I mean, Mossab is a perfect case in point. Mossab and I started communicating around 2018. And we were thinking about, you know, how to bring more work from Gaza into American English. And then I started reading his poems, and I was like, okay, this person is very, he has a vision and a way of presenting things that is unarguable. It's unarguable. It's there. You could choose to ignore it, or you could be extremely moved by it and changed. And one of the things in the interview that I was really, I pursued, in 2014, the university that he was at was bombed, and all the books were scattered all over the place, and he began to collect them and gather them. And he started piling them up at home, and then somebody suggested, well, he still thought, well, I should have a library. And then he created the Edward Said Library, which became like a community center, and then there were 2 of them. But as he was gathering the books, you know, he started talking about the poetry that impressed him, because he was, you know, you're taught Arabic poetry, traditional, you know, the mu'allaqat and classical poetry, Mutanabi and so on and so forth, and up to present, you know, all the Palestinian poets, modern Arabic poets. But, you know, he said, I read Wordsworth, you know, I wander lonely as a cloud. And I was like, oh my God. You know, he was like, through English romantic poetry, he started to look at what was in front of him and see that it was actually beautiful. You know, and I thought that was remarkable. This is at a point when, you know, we're canceling everybody, and these are dead white males and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so here's a person who grew up in a refugee camp, you know, in Al-Shati camp in Gaza, who is responding to William Wordsworth. Okay, I thought that's important. Okay, it's very important. So, you know, there are periods in our history when poetry matters more. There's a wonderful book called Words for the Hour, I think it's called. It's a collection of Civil War poetry, and it includes famous poets, Whitman and Emily Dickinson and so on and so forth, but it includes poems that appeared in newspapers, poems that appeared, it was a currency. People used poetry as a means of communicating their emotions or their feelings, and it was everywhere. And this is a wonderful collection which gives you this completely different sense of what the function of poetry was at that time. So I don't know if I hope we're maybe getting a little bit closer to that kind of thing, because I do see some, you know, vibrant, exciting things going on. So yeah.
Any last questions? Wonderful. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight.